Hey guys, it's time to do Chapter 5 sticky notes, or Section 4 for Unit 2. Chapter 5 is on the evolution of biodiversity. We're not going to worry about the case study here. Alright, so it starts with talking about biodiversity and what is biodiversity. And we know that there's three scales: ecosystem, species, and genetic, and that all three of these contribute to overall biodiversity of the planet. Genetic being kind of the most specific type of biodiversity. That would be diversity within the genes. Species is different species, ecosystems different ecosystems, and so the more varied these are, the more biodiverse an ecosystem is, or the earth is. Okay, so that's just to that's a little bit of a recap. As far as how many species live on earth, this number is kind of old. This is the updated number: 8.7 million species on Earth. Now do keep in mind they're not uniformly distributed, so it is hard for them to figure that out. And they're not exactly sure how many there are, but that's their estimate right now. And so just because there's that many species on Earth doesn't mean that every area has a lot of biodiversity. And so we'll talk about what that looks like here in just a minute. Okay, so looking at page 122, this is a really good figure that looks at measures of species diversity. And so the two things that it's looking at are species richness and species evenness. These are two measures of biodiversity. Species richness is the number of different species found in an ecosystem. So how many different species are there? The richer it is, the more different species there are, the more biodiverse. Species evenness would be the relative proportions of individuals within the different species. So how many of each species are represented in that particular area. The more equally represented they are, the more biodiverse it is. And so if you look at figure 5.4 here, you can see that you've got two different communities. Community 1 has 25% representation from 4 different species. Now community 2 also has 4 different species, but it has 70% of them are actually species A, 10% B, and 10% for the rest of them. So as far as richness, they're both equally rich because they both have the same number of species. But as far as evenness, community 1 is more even because they're more evenly proportioned relative to each other, versus community 2. So if something happens to like this species A that takes up 70%, could have a big problem, right, for that ecosystem as a whole. So species richness and species evenness. So make sure you understand the difference between those. Okay, so then there's like several pages, basically pages 124 to 126 is kind of talking about evolution and the basics of evolution and genetic diversity, and the fact that all of this leads to biodiversity. Okay, so the idea that as things change over time, they adapt to the environment around them, and we have a lot of biodiversity because of that. So I just want you to, I'm not gonna specify any like vocab or anything, but really this should just be basic stuff that you should have learned about in biology, and so just refresh yourself on evolution. Okay, so then the part I do want to call your attention to would be adaptations, which is of course part of evolution by natural selection. The fact that if you are able to survive in an environment, then you're going to be able to pass that on. So an adaptation improves an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. So that's what it's all about. Does it improve that individual's ability to survive, and then they have to be able to reproduce. And then this, of course, plays into effect with the species as a whole. And a good example of adaptations would be desert plants that are adapted to prevent water loss. And that's an adaptation that has allowed them to survive and reproduce. Now, adaptations are incremental changes at the genetic level that allow species to adapt to their environment over time. So adaptations, you can't just decide to adapt. That's not the kind of adapting we're talking about. We're talking about genetic adaptations genetic changes in, could be mutations, genetic changes in the DNA that allow certain individuals or species to actually be able to survive. And this is an adaptation. So a lot of times it's just very small little things that happen. Okay, so then talking about evolution kind of by random processes, there are four major ways that evolution occurs kind of randomly. And I just wanted to draw your attention to these. This really is best summed up by this figure right here, figure 5.12 on 129. But reading through these would be good as well, but I think this is a good way to sum it up. But you've got mutation, genetic drift, bottleneck effect, and the founder effect. So random mutations occur all the time that can can give certain species or individuals traits that allow them to survive and reproduce. Genetic drift, in a large population, the genetic composition pretty much stays the same just because there's so many of them. But in a small population, sometimes genetic drift would be like sometimes there are traits that kind of drift away from the regular population. And so, like you can see here, kind of the black mice, just that particular trait or adaptation is kind of drifted away. So now all we have left are the white ones, and very much less biodiverse. The bottleneck effect is the idea that something happens to greatly reduce the size of the population, and that's random because it doesn't decide like, well, I'm going to pick just the white ones or I'm just going to pick the black ones. So it's going to greatly decrease the size of the population, and then what's left is going to be what kind of populates from there on out. And then we have the founder effect, which we'll talk about more later in another unit. But the founder effect is the idea that you have, a couple from like the mainland end up on an island, and whichever ones end up there are the ones that are going to pass on their traits, their genes, and survive and reproduce. So this kind of forms new species and is a way that new species have come about. So just to call attention to population bottleneck again one more time, it can lead to a loss of genetic diversity, which leads to lower biodiversity, because we know that biodiversity is made up of those three scales: genetic, species, and ecosystem. Okay, so all we've been talking about basically is how new species are created, right? And so there are two major ways that new species are created, and that would be geographic isolation and reproductive isolation. So geographic isolation is exactly what it sounds like. Something comes in between. The geography separates two species, and then they actually grow enough apart, and their genes grow enough apart from each other that they can no longer breed together or reproduce together, so they become two separate species. Reproductive isolation is the idea that they've become so separated that they can't reproduce together, and that's officially what makes them a new species. So geographic isolation leads to reproductive isolation, but sometimes you can have reproductive isolation even though they're still together, but whatever changes in the genes might occur, it's enough that they cannot reproduce together. You do not need to know, so you'll see here like allopatric speciation, sympatric speciation. You don't need to know that. It's not necessary. Okay, so then let's talk about the pace of evolution. So how fast is evolution occurring? How quickly can different species come about or adapt or whatever it is? And this is summed up best by a figure on page 133. So it starts here at the bottom of 131 and goes all the way to 134. So just kind of the pace of evolution is going to be the next section. Okay, so here's the figure here. And these are different factors that determine the pace of evolution, and this is super, super important. A species can better adapt to an environmental change if, and there's several different key factors, and this is what you definitely need to know. A slowly changing environment gives species more time to adapt to the changes. So if the changes are occurring quickly, the species have less time to adapt, more likely to become extinct or to die out. Less genetic variation means there is less chance for the species to adapt. More genetic variation means they've got more traits available in order to be able to adapt. If a beneficial mutation occurs, it can spread more rapidly in a small population than in a large population. So the smaller population is, the faster that beneficial trait will spread. And then short generation times increase the chance that beneficial mutations will occur within a given amount of time. This is talking about like how quickly are your offspring created, how often you have offspring, you know, and so the shorter generation time means that they're going to be able to adapt faster versus if you are like an elephant and you have an offspring every 2 years or something or less, that is not going to be beneficial for those good mutations. Okay, so definitely look at this. You've got your rate of environmental change, genetic variation, population size, and generation time. Okay, those are key. So evolution shapes ecological niches. So evolution shapes biodiversity, and then this kind of gives different species like a range that they fit best in. So these vocab terms you need to know: range of tolerance, fundamental niche, and realized niche. Range of tolerance is those range of conditions that species need in order to survive and reproduce. And when they go outside of this range, then it stresses them and it can cause them to not be able to reproduce and then even maybe just be able to barely survive. Different kind of conditions we're talking about: temperature, salinity, flow rate, sunlight, pH, anything that could cause a stressor on species depending on where they are. So the fundamental niche is actually all the ideal. It's like the ideal range of where a species would live. So like ideally, if everything is there, everything is available, your fundamental niche, you know, might be like the ocean. But the realized niche is actually having to deal with other things being there too. So it's like your realistic, your reality. This niche is your reality. So yeah, you could take up the whole ocean, but guess what? There are other things there, and so you have to share that area with other things. Okay, so this is a good graph that you need to know, and so I would definitely draw this range of tolerance graph. The fact that when it's in the middle, it's kind of optimum, and then as it goes out, it's like outside of the range. And so there are different types of species that fit better in different types of situations. You have generalists and you have specialists. Generalists are species that have broad diets, like they can eat a lot of different things. They have wide habitat preferences. They can live in a lot of different places, and they're actually best in habitats that are constantly changing. Specialists, on the other hand, have narrow diets where they only eat certain things, like panda bears eat bamboo, right? That's pretty narrow. Specific habitat preference, they only live in certain places, and they're actually best in habitats that remain constant. So specialists are less likely to survive if there's a lot of change going on, or if something happens to their food source or to their habitat. And of course, changes in environmental conditions have the potential to affect species distribution. So we know that, especially with specialists, that they, you know, fit in certain habitats better. Well, changes in the conditions around them are going to affect where they are distributed. And that has happened over time, and evidence is seen in the fossil record of how different species have come about, disappeared, moved. Here's the bottom line. Species that can't adapt or move will eventually go extinct when environmental conditions change. And we know that they will. Environmental conditions change often, especially now more so than ever. And if the species can't adapt or they can't move away, maybe there's nowhere else to go, then that species will eventually go extinct. And we see that in fossil records. Okay, and then we're kind of ending off with the global mass extinctions, and there have been 5 global mass extinctions in the history of Earth. You don't need to know them or when they were or what they were named or anything like that, but you can see how they worked here. The important part is that we are currently in the 6th mass extinction. So scientists agree that we are in the 6th mass extinction, and this is the first one that is caused by humans. Human caused based on all of the different impacts that we have on the environment. Okay, so that is Chapter 5 on where biodiversity comes from, how it's evolved. So make sure that you are familiar with this chapter, and let me know if you have any questions.